As the Ukraine war grinds through 2025, President Vladimir Putin is bleeding cash. What was meant to be a quick invasion has spiraled into a financial nightmare, costing Russia an estimated $250 to $300 billion by February 2025 alone. Now faced with economic freefall, Putin has only two options: tighten the purse strings or let Russia collapse. He chose to tighten. Putin is slashing military spending just as the war reaches a critical tipping point. That's according to The Telegraph, which wrote on June 27th that Putin has announced massive plans to reduce the amount of money he spends on his military as Russia stares a recession square in the face. We don't know much about the intended cuts yet. All Russia's leader has told anybody is that he wants to cut defense spending next year and the year after, over the next 3-year period, during a press conference in Minsk. Of course, Putin tried to frame this as a positive. His comments came in the wake of reports of NATO's plans to raise its member nations' recommended defense spending to 5% of their gross domestic product, or GDP. That was a big win for US President Donald Trump. He'd been calling for that percentage in recent months, but for Putin, it's apparently a sign of Western aggression. He told the Minsk summit that NATO members spending more would increase purchases from the USA and on supporting their military-industrial complex. Putin went on to query, so who is preparing for some kind of aggressive actions, us or them? That seems rich coming from a man who spent over 3 years waging war against another nation, pumping up his country's defense spending and creating a military-industrial complex of his own. We need only look at Russia's recent spending to see Putin's hypocrisy. Back in September, Reuters reported that Russia was preparing to hike spending in 2025 by 25%, meaning Putin intended to pour $145 billion into his country's military as it entered the 4th year of a supposed special military operation that was meant to last for a few days. That announcement meant that defense spending would account for 32% of Russia's total budget expenditure in 2025 and was a complete turnaround from the supposed 21% the Kremlin intended to spend in 2025. That spending also stands at 6.3% of Russia's GDP, 1.3% more than NATO's redefined spending requirements. So even as he points to NATO's increased spending as a sign of aggression, Putin was spending more on his military in terms of GDP than any NATO nation will. And there were already plenty of signs that this was a bad thing for Russia's economy. Back in January, Russian political analyst Pavel Lutzin wrote a piece for the Center for European Policy Analysis, or CEPA, in which he labeled 2025 as the year of Russia's runaway military budget. In 2024, Lutzin claimed, Russia clearly exceeded its planned spending of $101 billion, likely hitting closer to $129 billion. The announcement of increased spending for 2025 signaled more bad news for Russia, Lutzin wrote. The budget-busting expenditure follows a pattern of military costs exceeding treasury plans since the full-scale invasion in 2022, he wrote. Lutzin also shared a chart showcasing that Russia's military expenditure had more than tripled since 2021. What we see here are the effects of a leader who's unable to accept that his invasion failed. Rather than pull back, Putin went all in, spending more than his country could afford for years to fund his ill-fated invasion. Putin may try to claim that Russia reducing military expenditure as NATO members increase their spending as a sign of Western aggression, but the reality is far simpler. Russia is being forced to spend less money on its military because Putin is running out of cash. And he's had plenty of warnings this would happen. Putin's announcement comes just days after Russia's Minister of Economic Development, Maxim Reshetnikov, claimed that Russia was on the brink of going into a recession, according to The Telegraph. Those comments were mirrored by Russian central bank governor Elena Nabiullina, who noted that Russia is starting to suffer from a resource problem. We grew for 2 years at a fairly high pace because free resources were activated. We need to understand that many of these resources have truly been exhausted. Growing economically is exactly what Russia did, at least that's how it seemed. Putin's comments about cutting military expenditure come on the back of Russia enjoying 4.3% economic growth in 2024. On the surface, that would seem to be a good thing. A growing economy suggests that money is pouring in. However, the reality is far different, and it's a reality that Putin is being forced to face. Russia's supposedly growing economy hides a litany of issues that are plaguing the country. Putin's reduction of Russia's military spending is a band-aid attempting to cover a gaping financial wound. The reality is that Russia's economy has spiraled into a freefall. Putin's cuts aren't a sign that he's becoming less aggressive. Instead, they're a sign that he's damaged Russia's economy so badly with his war that he can no longer spend at the level he has been. Russia's leader just admitted something he never wanted the world to know. His country is in dire economic straits, and it's Putin's invasion that caused it all. So just how bad is the situation in Russia? We'll start with the interrelated issues of inflation and interest rates. According to The Telegraph, Russia's 4.3% economic growth in 2024 managed to briefly hide the fact that growth was coming at a harsh cost to the Russian people. Rampant inflation has been a problem in the country for months, as have interest rates. The latter reached an eye-watering 21% in October 2024, though the base rate has been cut to 20% in June, as economic pressure on Russia eased ever so slightly. The BBC went into more detail, noting that Russia's 4.3% growth compared favorably to the US and the UK, which achieved 2.8% and 1.1% respectively during the same year. Yet all of that growth was being fueled by Putin's military spending, and with the massive interest rates and inflation, it was coming at the cost of his people. Take inflation as an example. That reached 9.9% in May, which was actually a softening from the 10.2% seen in April. What this means for everyday Russians is that the price of living has become almost unbearable amidst Putin's war. In May alone, food prices rose 12.5%, with fruits and vegetables experiencing inflation of 19.8%. Non-food products fared a little better at 4.8%, though services experienced inflation of 12.6%. This is all just a one-month snapshot. It's been like this in Russia for a very long time. For Russian consumers, this rampant inflation has created a lot of pressure. That's what inflation does. A ruble in the pocket that was worth X amount a couple of months ago is now worth far less. The cash that everyday Russians earn doesn't stretch as far as it used to, and that's something Russia has been trying to hide. As The Insider reported in November 2024, Russia tends to obfuscate its poverty figures. The first half of 2024 saw it claim that 13.3 million of its people lived in poverty. However, The Insider says that the real figure was likely anywhere between 14.6 and 18 million by the end of 2023. With The Insider claiming that many of the people Russia claims aren't poor are struggling to pay for necessities, such as food and clothing. It's been over a year since The Insider made those claims, and the situation has only grown worse. Inflation remains high, and the pressures being placed on everyday Russians are coming close to being unbearable. All of this is due to Putin's invasion. Coming back to Russia's interest rates, there's slightly good news for Putin, with the country's central bank deciding to reduce the base rate to 20%. But even that is barely going to make a dent. That's according to SIPA senior fellow Alexander Kolyander, who told Central Banking on June 9th that the Russian people can't expect much to change with that rate decrease. This is not the beginning of an easing cycle, Kolyander said. It's a one-off adjustment reflecting the fact that inflation peaked at the end of April or in early May. What we have here is a country that's buckling under the economic weight of Putin's war. And it's not just Russia's military spending that is causing these problems. Western sanctions have also contributed heavily to this dire economic situation. Since Putin invaded Ukraine, Western countries, along with nations like Japan and Australia, have implemented 21,692 sanctions against Russia, says Castellum.ai. In total, Russia is laboring under the weight of 24,311 sanctions, which is over 4 times the number of sanctions faced by Iran, and well over 5 times those faced by Syria. Those sanctions have been key to Russia's inflation woes, The Telegraph says, because they've drastically increased Russia's import costs. Interestingly, Russia hasn't been able to skirt these sanctions as well as it would have hoped. Francis Seppi points out that the cost of Russia's purchases from its non-sanctioning partners has risen by 21% on average than they have elsewhere between 2020 and 2024. This tells us that Putin is stuck between a rock and a hard place. On one hand, he has to spend far more than he did in the past to buy products from the nations that have implemented sanctions against Russia. On the other hand, the countries that don't have sanctions in place are taking advantage of the fact that Russia has nowhere else to turn, and have raised their prices accordingly. Nowhere is this more obvious than in strategic goods found on the Ukraine war battlefield, Seppi says, which cost Russia 122% more to buy from non-sanctioning partners by mid-2024 than they did in 2020. The Jamestown Foundation says that up until now, Putin has been able to use his Ukraine invasion as both a justification for and a diversion away from Russia's worsening economic situation. That can't last forever. Russia faces a narrowing set of options for sustainable growth, it says, with any peace settlement negotiated with Ukraine likely to expose the Kremlin's mismanagement of Russia's funds on a massive scale. That shows us what we're really seeing with Putin's cuts to military expenditure. Russia's leader is a desperate man. He knows that his invasion has led his country into economic doldrums, regardless of what Russia's 2024 growth figures might suggest. High inflation combined with high interest rates are hitting his people hard. Adding the weight of Western sanctions to the mix creates even more pressure, under which Russia is collectively buckling. It's starting to look as if an economic collapse is in Russia's future. And it gets worse, much worse. Putin's announcement also comes at a time when Russia is facing a massive labor shortage, RBC Ukraine says in its report on the decision to cut Russia's military expenditure. It says that Moscow's Higher School of Economics believes that this labor shortfall is so extensive that it reached 2.6 million people by the end of 2024. The Kyiv Independent offered more details in a May report, noting that several of Russia's key industries are feeling the sharp end of those labor shortages more than others. Manufacturing has 391,000 positions it can't fill, the outlet says. Russia's trade sector has 347,000 open positions, with transportation having 219,000 open slots. Across those sectors, employers are being forced to offer wages above $1,200 per month, which is 1.5 times the Russian average. Of course, Putin will try to frame all of this in a positive light. Another spin on Russia's labor situation is that the average Russian saw their wage rise by 20% in 2024. Putin can also point to low unemployment and can rightly claim that 61% of Russian people over the age of 15 are engaged in the country's labor market. These might be good things if it wasn't for the fact that low unemployment in this case means there aren't enough people for the positions Russia needs to fill. As for the wage increases, they're a symptom both of this labor shortfall and the inflation that's cutting everyday Russians off at the knees. A 20% bump in your pay packet doesn't mean much when inflation is so high that you're not feeling any sort of positive effects. There are several reasons why Russia finds itself in this situation, all of which are linked to Putin's war. Labor migration has fallen off a cliff, with migrant labor being a particular problem. Novaya Gazeta said in October 2024 that one unnamed Russian Interior Ministry official believes that Russia needs at least 3 million more migrant workers to fill key positions in the country in the wake of the Ukraine invasion. Those migrant workers aren't coming. Insecurity in the ruble and multiple economic shocks are also partially to blame, the Kyiv Independent says. But far and away the biggest issue is that the people who are supposed to be filling the open positions in so many of Russia's industries are currently fighting and dying on the Ukrainian battlefield. On June 22nd, The Guardian reported that Russia had hit the grim milestone of 1 million soldier casualties. That's great news for Russia's funeral industry. Its profits saw a 12.7% increase year-on-year between January and April 2025. But when it comes to an already struggling labor market, the scale of these losses isn't good for Putin. He's essentially cost his country 1 million workers and counting at a time when it needs around 2 million to plug its labor shortfall. Speaking of those soldiers, they're also an economic burden on Russia and likely part of the reason why Putin has announced his military cuts. Spending has been Putin's solution when trying to maintain the high volume of troops he needs to maintain in Ukraine to continue putting pressure on his enemy's forces. According to The Conversation, a soldier who signs a contract with the Russian military today earns around $2,034 per month, placing them in the top 10% of Russia's earners. Add to these massive salaries the large signing-on bonuses and the benefits Russia offers to the families of soldiers, and you get a constant cash drain that Russia can't afford to maintain. Daily troop losses are still massive in Ukraine. On June 29th alone, Russia lost around 1,220 soldiers, and those numbers are not remarkable. They're the standard. Over 1,000 Russian soldiers die or get injured in Ukraine daily. This rate continues to the end of 2025. That's at least 184,000 that will be added to the more than 1 million casualties Russia has experienced so far. Those soldiers need replacing. And for that, Putin needs money that he doesn't have. And that raises some interesting questions about what Putin's decision to cut Russia's military budget means, both for the future of his country and his invasion of Ukraine. Logically, spending less money on the military means that Russia will hire fewer soldiers. That means Russia will not be able to cover the losses it's experiencing on the battlefield. The alternative is to spend less money on procuring the equipment those soldiers need to wage Putin's war. More problems will arise as a result. With less equipment, those soldiers aren't as effective as they would otherwise be when they launch attacks on Ukrainian positions. The results will be obvious. More Russian casualties that force Putin to pull more people out of his country's already depleted workforce to keep his war going. Which way Putin goes will depend on what he thinks are the best options for balancing Russia's books. However, either of these situations amounts to a weakening of the Russian military at a key juncture. Right now, Russia is in the midst of a summer offensive targeting Sumy and Donetsk. That offensive hasn't amounted to much. The Kyiv Post points out that Russia has managed to capture a lithium deposit in Donetsk, but beyond that, major victories haven't come, with Putin instead having to be satisfied by a supposedly large offensive that's only snatching up small pieces of territory. The momentum Russia's leader needs simply isn't there. And it's not going to come now that he's chopping Russia's military budget. Whether it's fewer people, less equipment, or both, Russia spending less on the Ukraine invasion spells bad news for Putin. He's relied on Russia's overwhelming numbers to get as far as he has since February 2022. If the money dries up, those numbers go down and more openings arise for Ukraine to launch counterattacks and rack up even more casualties than it already is. As for Russia itself, the future looks bleak. The Telegraph says that the country's banking officials are already privately warning of the risk of an economic crisis in the coming years. Interest rates have a part to play in that. As businesses struggle to find people, they are unable to grow their profits. With that lack of profit comes an inability to repay loans that have been taken out, meaning such businesses are at risk of insolvency. A cynical person might see that as a solution to Russia's labor crisis. The more companies that go out of business, the fewer workers are needed. But trading job availability for the mass unemployment these bankruptcies would cause hardly seems like the most elegant solution. More costs lie in Russia's future when it comes to reintegrating the veterans of the Ukraine conflict back into society. We can see this already. The Telegraph says that around 140,000 soldiers have already returned from the conflict. Of those 140,000, around half are unemployed, despite the fact that Russia has a labor crunch. That tells us that money isn't being invested into reskilling these soldiers or providing them with pathways into civilian employment once their military service ends. As of November 2024, 580,000 Russian soldiers were fighting in Ukraine. Imagine if Putin's war were to end tomorrow thanks to a peace deal. That's 580,000 soldiers coming back to a Russia that is already proving itself unable to find work for its veterans. The great irony here is that work is available, plenty of it. But as has so often been the case with the Ukraine war, Putin's transformation of his country into a military-industrial complex is coming back to bite him. The available jobs aren't suitable for the soldiers returning home, meaning Russia will either have to spend even more to help those troops move forward or leave them languishing within a broken economy. Putin, at least, seems unfazed. When announcing his military expenditure cuts, he joked, "As far as the murder of the Russian economy is concerned, as a famous writer once said, rumors of my death are greatly exaggerated." But are they? None of the signs for Russia's economic future are looking good, and a small cut to military expenditure likely isn't going to be enough to offer a solution. And it's only going to get worse from here. As Russia struggles under the weight of its economic woes, Ukraine is hitting it hard with drones on its own territory, costing the country over $10 billion in the process. Find out more in our video, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show if you want more video commentary on the situation Putin has created for his country thanks to his Ukraine invasion. And thank you, as always, for watching.